I'm going to do, I was told this was supposed to be instructive rather than particularly new research. I want to look at foundational issues in religion from the perspective of Bayesian epistemology. The first speaker yesterday touched on various aspects of Bayesian epistemology. I'm going to assume you know nothing about Bayesian epistemology. I'm going to just run quickly through a few of the fundamentals and then start building on that. And try to look at a few issues and arguments from the perspective of Bayesian epistemology. And hopefully in the first part today I'll get to fine-tuning arguments. And I want to get you into the frame of mind that I'm in, where I find it hard to sort of, from a Bayesian perspective at least, get a really good feel for how fine-tuning arguments are supposed to be working. And I'll illustrate some other pitfalls and fallacies along the way. The Bayesian thinks of the epistemic state of a person at a time as importantly representable as a probability space, where for this or that proposition, there's a probability that that speaker, that proposition has for that speaker at that time, where that you may or may not think of that in terms of the degree of confidence the speaker has in that proposition. So we've got the probability space for a proposition at a time. I mean, let's take a very simple model where there are just 3 shapes and 2 colors. Well, there are, 8 possibilities. Maybe there's just one thing. You don't know its shape, you don't know its color. 3 possible shapes, 2 possible colors. Well, the probability space in that very simple setting is going to consist of an assignment to each color shape combination. And you could, represent it as a sort of bar where, say, for red and circular, supposing that's one of the colors and that's one of the shapes, that's a proposition. The thing is red and circular, and the probability you assign it is a matter of how much of the whole bar is taken up by that sliver. So we can spatially represent a possibility space. And for people that don't know a lot of math, I think it's very therapeutic to do Bayesian epistemology using bars and geometry rather than mathematical calculation. So first I thought is the epistemic state at a time is given by a probability distribution. Evidence is then thought of as knocking out some slivers of your bar. Basically, evidence is just ruling out certain possibilities. Suppose someone tells you, well, I'm not going to tell you exactly what color and shape it is, but I'll tell you what, it's not circular. Well, suppose it's circular, triangular, or square. They're the 3 shapes. And red and blue, the colors. Well, it's not circular. You'll rule out you'll erase the circular and red sliver. You'll erase the circular and blue sliver. And the remaining slivers will become your whole chocolate bar. What Bayesians call conditionalization is basically, when you think about it geometrically, just a matter of erasing and renormalizing, where you rub out some slivers and then you make what's left the whole bar. And what you make sure that you do is preserve the ratios between the old slivers. So if the ratio between red and square and red and triangular was, they took up exactly the same proportion of the original bar, then to obey conditionalization requires inter alia that when you erase the various slivers on the new information, you make sure they have the same ratio in the new chocolate bar or epistemic bar, okay? That's all conditionalization is, erasing and renormalizing, keeping the ratios the same for the ones that, the ratios between the slivers that remain matches their old ratios, okay? So that's conditionalization. So that's the second thought, that in rational creatures, epistemic states evolve by conditionalization. You knock out slivers of your epistemic bar by acquiring evidence. That's what acquiring evidence consists in. And then you generate a new probability space via erasing and renormalizing. Okay? That's the second bit. What is it for a piece of evidence to be evidence for a proposition? Well, suppose a certain proposition is gets 0.3 in your earlier space, but getting just that evidence means biconditionalization generates a new bar that makes that proposition a higher probability. Then that's what it means basically for evidence to be evidence for a proposition. It's a probability raiser. That's there are subtleties, but the idea of something being evidence for a proposition is for it to be a probability raiser. Okay, that's the idea. A few more preliminaries. There's not that much to know in terms of the preliminaries. One thing to get straight in terms of preliminaries is there's no straightforward connection between the ideology of evidence and the ideology of explanation. That some things are that E is evidence for H does not tell you anything straightforward just in itself about the facts of explanation. Sometimes, in some settings, when something's evidence for something else, the something else explains the evidence. That's one kind of subcase. So easy case is where symptoms are evidence for a certain disease. In that kind of setting, it's natural to think of the disease as at least a good candidate explanation of the evidence. But in other cases, not. Suppose someone gives Simon some soup, and I notice he finds it completely disgusting. Well, I think that's evidence that I'd find the soup disgusting, and so it raises the probability that I would find the soup disgusting, that he finds it disgusting, because, it's evidence. But it's not that, it's not that my finding the soup disgusting explains him finding the soup disgusting or vice versa. It's not like that. So in that kind of case, you've got evidence that's evidence for a proposition, but that doesn't signal an explanatory connection between hypothesis and evidence. So if you start to have some too overly toy recipe for connecting the facts of probability raising with the facts of explanation, you're going to get confused. So I want to make sure we're not doing any of that. Just a few more bits of background, just two more, and then we can get going with this. Your probability space will involve various possibilities that each take up a chunk of the chocolate bar. Possibilities in this sense aren't possibilities in the sense philosophers are talking about when they talk about metaphysical possibilities, ways the world could really be. In the typical case, there'll be slivers of your chocolate bar, epistemic bar, that are epistemic possibilities, even though they're not metaphysical possibilities. It's an epistemic possibility for me that Shakespeare was identical to Lord Bacon. I don't give that a high chunk. I guess some people even give that a high chunk. But, I give it a little sliver in my epistemic bar. But on standard assumptions, if in fact Shakespeare was not identical to Lord Bacon, then it's metaphysically impossible that Shakespeare was identical to Lord Bacon. So we'll have all sorts of slivers in our epistemic space that are epistemic possibilities that don't correspond to metaphysical possibilities. So when I talk about possibility in this epistemic space, it's got nothing to do in any straightforward way with metaphysical possibility. So I just want that to be clear at the get-go. Just last thing to be straight about, and then we can get going, is the notion of what I'll call an prior. Bayesians often have a reconstruction of their epistemic situation, according to which there is this thing, an prior, which is the epistemic space on no evidence. And then they often reconstruct their current epistemic space as, at least in the just so story, as the result of taking the prior and shoving in all the evidence they've ever got into the prior. Okay? And that's the notion of an prior is fairly standard in these Bayesian discussions. It's, as it were, what probability you want to give to this or that on no evidence whatsoever, and then that'll give you the prior, and, you know, as you've got no evidence, pretty much everything will be possible, you know, apart from the negation of tautologies and this and that. And there'll be a space which is your prior, and then that, as evidence comes in, that will evolve. And you're often apt to tell a just so story. It's not like you come out of the womb with an prior, but Bayesians often tell a just so story according to which there's an prior that's implicit in their vision of things, and one can reconstruct the actual, their actual epistemic space in terms of the result of conditionalizing their totality of lifetime evidence on their prior. That's something to understand. There are two very different kinds of perspectives on priors, on, you know, just how likely you think this or that is on no evidence. The subjective Bayesians think that this is an irrational thing. It's not something that can itself be evaluated for rationality. That's just a fact about how people are built, what their priors are. You know, no, according to this subjective Bayesian, it's not like cosmology has any insight into priors, or philosophy has any insight into priors. People are built with implicitly priors, and they can't be evaluated for rationality, those priors. If you've got a friend with very different priors, your friend is going to seem quite strange to you, perhaps in various ways, but there's no rational discussion. I mean, maybe you could shake the person and sort of, you know, recalibrate their priors, or maybe you can kind of seduce them into different priors, but there's no rational forced march to different priors, and there's not even, you know, any rational, deep rational criticism of their priors. There aren't facts about what priors we ought to have. There's just Sean's priors, Lara's priors, mine priors. Oh, you're built that way, very interesting. I'm built this way, and that's all there is to say. And then there are the kinds of Bayesians that think there are fundamental normative facts about priors. There are the priors that Lara or myself or Sean or Bill might in fact have, but then there are the priors you ought to have. There are facts about how plausible you ought to find this or that on no evidence. And there are intermediate views. You might think, well, there's no definite priors you ought to have, but there are some you definitely oughtn't to have, and there's a range. Maybe it's vague what the true priors are, but they're definitely not that, and they're definitely not that. So, you know, we've got two very different kind of Bayesians according to whether they think that priors, those fundamental priors, those judgments of plausibility, of probability that are abstracted away from all evidence, are the things of a sort that can be evaluated for rationality, or things not. Okay? Now you know everything you need to know about Bayesianism. So let's get going. Let's straight away make sure we don't make some mistakes, and we see as uncontroversial what is uncontroversial. So let's take the hypothesis that there's a supernatural creator with a life fetish. Okay? All I mean there is there's a supernatural creator that really has a thing for living things, you know, has a strong desire to create living things. That's the hypothesis, that there's a supernatural creator of the physical universe with a life fetish, okay? That's for short God, okay? Everyone, mad dog atheist, at least if you're working within this sort of framework, absolutely everyone should think that the fact that there's life is evidence for God. Everyone should think that, absolutely everyone. That is not controversial, that the fact of life is evidence for God. Just think how the Bayesian epistemic bar will evolve. Before you get, think of the priors before that evidence comes in. There'll be a chunk of the bar, I don't really care how big, with no life, and then there'll be a chunk with life, and then there'll be no sub-chunk of this with God in it, because God's incompatible, let's suppose, with no life, and there'll be a chunk of the life bar such that with God, it might be a big chunk, I don't care how big that sliver is. When you discover there's life, suppose that's the totality of your new evidence, that involves just erasing that sliver. You erase that sliver, you then renormalize. It's very clear that however big this, whatever probability G had to begin with, it's going to grow. That's completely uncontroversial. G will grow. That's not something which we should be discussing as atheists or theists. It's completely uncontroversial that life is evidence for God. Complete from a Bayesian perspective. Of course, on the other hand, while that's uncontroversial, it doesn't say very much, because it might still be that the probability of God, even though it's raised by life, is incredibly small. Might be tiny, tiny. Let's take another hypothesis, that there's a creator with a cheese fetish whose fundamental desire was to make cheese, okay? When I see a piece of cheese, it's completely uncontroversial. That's evidence for the existence of a being with a cheese fetish, a supernatural creator with a cheese fetish. That's uncontroversial. By exactly the same reasoning, there's a cheese part of the prior, there's a no cheese part of the prior. The cheesy part of the prior will have a sliver, pretty small sliver in it, with a supernatural creator with a cheese fetish. And that sliver, albeit small, will grow when I erase the no cheese sliver. If you just understand what conditionalization is, you will see that cheese is evidence for the existence of a supernatural being with a cheese fetish. So that's not a question we should be discussing, whether life is evidence for God. It is. Just like it's not a question whether cheese is evidence for the existence of a supernatural being with a cheese fetish. It is. Of course, that doesn't, but on the other hand, that doesn't get us very far, because compatible with the ontendentious observation, we might still think that even though life is evidence for God, the current probability of God is overwhelmingly low, or we might not. But don't let us argue about whether life's evidence for God. That's not the right place to be bearing down, at least from this perspective. Everyone should be agreed about that. Okay. Let me just do a little bit more ground clearing. And there's a fallacy. I don't want to say that Sean was guilty of it. I think he knows better to be guilty of it. But I felt he was talking in a way that might seduce others in the audience to lapse into this bad thought. So I want to make sure you don't lapse. I want to protect you, even if Sean doesn't need protection. Here's a bad thought. It might sound good, but it's a terrible thought. Suppose we get some data. And that data, if we look at our priors, prior to getting that, relative to our previous perspective, that data was unbelievably unlikely on the hypothesis of God. It was very, very unlikely. So we get some data. That data was relative to our prior position, extremely unlikely on the hypothesis of God. here's the bad thought. You think, well, if we get data that's very unlikely on the hypothesis of God, then that's bad news for theism. That's a fallacy. If you start to talk that way, that's a bad thought. And sort of here's an analogy. Suppose I don't know whether, say, David likes me or not. I've got two hypotheses. He likes me, he doesn't like me. And then one day he gives me 14 Toblerones gift wrapped in a pink and blue spotted box with a big bow on it. Well, that data, even on the hypothesis that he likes me, is very, very unlikely. I mean, how likely was it that, apparently sober philosopher would give me this? Even on the hypothesis that he likes me. Incredibly unlikely. But nevertheless, it's good news for the, I think it's, over all things considered, it's good news for the hypothesis that he likes me. Not bad news. So it's completely irrelevant to these discussions that we encounter data that's unlikely on the hypothesis of God. What we should do is to be looking at we should be, suppose we've got God and no God, we should look at the original probabilistic ratio, and then we get some data, and we should think, how likely was that data on the hypothesis of God, and how likely was that data on the hypothesis of no God, and that's another ratio. And then we look at the, we ask ourselves whether the relative slivers, whether how the new ratio compares to the old ratio. And basically, if the data takes up a bigger proportion of the God region than the no God region, then the data is good evidence, is good news, not bad news for theism. If the data takes up a bigger proportion of the God region than the no God region, then the data is good news for theism, not bad news for theism. So I just want to make sure that we don't at all lapse into the mistake of thinking that because we encounter data that's unlikely on theism, that's somehow of itself bad news for theism. That's not the right way to be thinking. Don't do that. Okay. And now, want to introduce you to what I think of, and this came up in discussion with David the other night, so it seemed to me a good way to sort of sort out your distinguished atheist friends, when it comes to Bayesian conversation. I want to distinguish between the mad dog atheist and other atheists, okay? It's a distinction among atheists, mad dog atheists and other atheists. And when I read Hume's dialogues, I get a suspicion of mad dog atheism for reasons that I'll explain to you. And I think it's quite important to get a feel for this. And it's a matter of the priors. So the mad dog atheist thinks this: no matter what empirical mosaic you present me with as a possible sort of physical history of the world, relative to any possible physical history, the hypothesis of naturalism is favored over supernaturalism. So there's no conceivable physical history of the world such that on it supernaturalism is more likely than naturalism. So a mad dog atheist priors are like this: take any physical history, complete physical history you like. Within that sliver, supernaturalism will take up a smaller proportion than naturalism. That's what the mad dog atheist is like. The more guarded atheist, who might still be an atheist, might still think it's overwhelmingly likely that there's no God, has a different perspective, has a different kind of prior. The more guarded atheist has the perspective, hey, there are some physical histories that are conceivable relative to my priors, such that on those, conditional on those, I'd favor supernaturalism over naturalism. Of course, I don't think I've been presented with evidence that the good evidence that the physical world conforms to one or some relevant class of those histories. But nevertheless, I concede that on certain physical histories, supernaturalism is favored. Let's look at a few examples of this. Why do I say Hume is a mad dog atheist? I think Hume thinks no matter what physical history you give me, I mean, I'm sort of playing fast and loose slightly here, it's kind of just a superfluous, junky add-on to throw in some supernatural being that planned this or that aspect of that history. It's just additional junk. And I'll speak as a Humean Bayesian. My priors tell me, no matter relative to any mosaic, I'll favor that mosaic without the junk over that mosaic with the junk. So it just looks like junk, a junky add-on relative to any physical history. That's what my mad dog atheist says. One example, the old medieval impetus theory said that basically they weren't into Newton's first law, so their picture was, things have quantities of motion, and then unless they have more motion infused, they kind of run out of steam. I mean, that's the fundamental principle of physical motion. And we could sort of imagine a set of evidence, perhaps, where, not like our actual evidence, where impetus theory starts to look pretty good. And in impetus theory, the medievals found some encouragement for theism along the following lines. They looked around and thought, this is interesting. On the one hand, we've got very good evidence for impetus theory. I mean, they probably didn't, so I'm sort of taking a few liberties here. But on the other hand, if there wasn't supernatural infusion of motion from the outside, we'd be expecting the physical universe to be running out of steam, basically, because there's a certain quantity of motion. It would run out of steam. It would slow down without some extra infusion. But in fact, the physical universe isn't slowing down. So it rounds out our impetus theory very nicely to hypothesize a supernatural creator that's infusing motion into the physical world to keep it going. Now, of course, we haven't got evidence of very good evidence right now for impetus theory, but I'm exploring the priors. This is Bayesian exploration of your priors. Are you the kind of guy that thinks, well, there could have been, there are patterns of data which suggest impetus theory and are nicely rounded out by the hypothesis of a supernatural agent that infuses motion to keep things going? Or is there no pattern of data or physical history or this or that where that's a promising hypothesis? Second example, well, I'm going to go through examples. I mean, imagine it turned out, the data came in and the way things were at the center of things is a planet with living beings on it, us, and there's no living beings anywhere else, and everything is revolving around us. I mean, suppose that's how things turned out, where we look pretty special on that story. Conditional on that evidence, do you think it's pretty likely that there's a supernatural creator come designer? Or are you the sort of person that thinks even on that evidence, it's still completely, radically unlikely that there's a supernatural designer? Third example I got from David here. I was getting the feeling he's not Mad Dog. Suppose, consider the sliver of your priors where things kind of go as they have, but turns out that the initial configuration of particles spelt out the entirety of the New Testament in Greek. Consider that hypothesis. The initial conditions involve a configuration of particles that spell out the entirety of the New Testament in Greek. And, yada, yada, yada. The mad dog person will think, well, will sort of make the following speech. Well, that's interesting. That was, but my favorite atheistic theory allows this as a possibility. So, it broke that way. I still strongly, even on that information, conditional on that information. It's not exactly information that's easy to get. But I'm talking about the priors and the conditional probabilities. It's a further issue whether you can get a sliver as a piece of evidence. Still conditional on that, I'm much more confident in an atheistic theory that says that configuration is humanly striking but of no great significance over a supernatural hypothesis that offers some unifying explanation of certain activities of humans and the configuration in terms of maybe either some Christian story or some story of a Hindu god playing a big trick, or the various supernatural hypotheses that would explain it. I'm not fussing about those. I'm just talking about the supernatural versus natural. And I was getting the feeling David is a not mad dog. Sean, I'm not sure. I get slightly mad dog vibes out of Sean. But these, I think they're interesting questions about the priors. But, when you encounter people who are mad dog or not mad dog on this sort of thing, don't think that because they know a lot of cosmology, that's going to tell you very much. I mean, whether you're going for the supernaturalism, overnaturalism on that history isn't going to be have very much to do with cosmology. It's to do with fundamental sort of intellectual orientation. There's nothing, I'm not mad dog. There's absolutely nothing that Sean or anyone else could say to make me mad dog about that. If you're a subjective Bayesian, you'll have the view that, well, that's just how we're built, whether you're mad dog or not mad dog. And if you're objective Bayesian, there's not much that you can do to convince each other, because probably if I'm not mad dog, I'll have the view you ought to find the supernatural thing plausible, pretty plausible, conditional on that hypothesis. The mad dog thing person will say the opposite, and there's not very much we can do to have a fruitful conversation. We're going to reach an impasse very quickly. So I think there's a general lesson, which is you should get a feel for which kinds of differences are differences in these foundational priors and where you're likely to reach an impasse. And each side is under an illusion if they somehow think that science will reveal one of you to be badly calibrated or well calibrated. But then there are other issues which have, where the story is different. Of course, the mad dog person will say, conditional on that, I think the best thing to say is that there's no explanation of that initial configuration of atoms. The supernaturalist will say, conditional on that mosaic, I'm pretty confident that there is an explanation of that configuration, one that provides a unifying explanation of that configuration and certain activities in the history of human beings. That's how they'll announce their position, but it's not that they can make progress by playing the rhetoric of explanation. They'll just use a rhetoric of explanation in a way that coordinates fairly well with their fundamental priors. So the rhetoric of explanation won't be a means to make progress for that sort of fundamental difference in orientation. It'll just be a way of articulating a difference in orientation. Now, I want to provide some toy models that I think are suggestive of certain epistemic facts. There's a thing that Sean said that I found very interesting, which was the thought that when you look into the world and you start noticing, boy, there's a lot of planets out there. There's a lot of planets out there. That's somehow bad news for God. I think I have some sympathy with this thought, and I want to provide a little model for how you might think about it. It's a toy model, but how you might think about the idea that looking out in the world and seeing lots and lots and lots of planets, that pretty picture he showed us, where each little dot represents, a ton of planets, basically. That picture is somewhat bad news for theism. I mean, of course, the totality of our evidence might, militate in a different direction, but I think it's good to understand what it might be like to be the kind of person that looks at that photograph and thinks, wow, that's bad news. So here's my little toy model. It's very toy. I'm doing little toy Bayesian models of everything today and tomorrow. So at least here's a guy for which that would be bad news, I think. I mean, I haven't checked. This is how the chocolate bar or the epistemic bar of this guy goes. So maybe his priors are like this. 50-50 supernaturalism versus, I'll put it this way, supernaturalism versus naturalism. And then let me introduce you to the distinction between life-friendly laws and non-life-friendly laws. Life-friendly laws are ones where pretty much, in terms of our priors, I mean, this is all a bit crude, we'd expect, given those laws, for pretty much any planet to have life, or the probability of a planet having life is pretty high on these laws, okay? It's all very simplified, whereas life-unfriendly laws are, for any given planet, they're not very likely that there'll be life, just on an arbitrary planet. An arbitrary planet where you don't have much information about that planet, your expectation that that planet will have life is low, okay? You get the distinction, my little toy distinction. I don't want to, we'll be talking about fine-tuning later. This isn't a fine-tuning discussion, I'm just illustrating. So we've got life-friendly laws and life-unfriendly laws, and let's suppose our guy, of course, life-unfriendly laws are compatible with life. I mean, if you're God, you might have life-unfriendly laws and just make sure that you rig the planet, at least a few of the planets in a way that gets life going. So if you've got a life fetish, that doesn't militate against life-unfriendly laws. It just means that you have to make sure that some planets are rigged in a way that the life-unfriendly laws can provide life in those special cases. Maybe he's 50-50, whether God would have life-unfriendly laws or life-friendly laws. And on naturalism, maybe similarly, in terms of priors, life-friendly and life-unfriendly. And then maybe in terms of priors, this is all very simplified, there might be a few planets or lots and lots of planets. So there's the priors will have as one subcase naturalism and life-friendly laws and lots of planets, naturalism, life-friendly laws and a few planets, naturalism, life-unfriendly laws and lots of planets, naturalism, life-unfriendly laws and a few planets. And let's suppose that all goes 25% of each on each side, an eighth of the whole. So that's loads and a few, loads and a few. And in this very simplified model, life-friendly laws will generate life in nearly all of the cases where there are loads. If they're life-friendly laws, you'll generate life. The squiggles are life portions. This will all be life because it's a guy with a God fetish. I'm just, in my simplified thing, that's the only supernatural hypothesis, yes? So it's all very simplified. It's just to get the little toy model. Loads of laws, loads of planets, even with life on friendly laws, if there are loads of planets, then a big chunk of the time, not all of it, but a big chunk of the time there'll be life somewhere. But with a few planets and life on friendly laws, there'll only be life a little bit of the time. Okay? Suppose you then learn that there's life. That will give a boost to supernaturalism on this, that will give a boost to supernaturalism. But if you think about it, if you understand how the conditionalization goes, if you then learn that there are loads of planets, then that will give a bit of a boost in the other direction to naturalism. Because after all, once you learn that there's life, you knock out all this chunk, and then this swamps that in the way you'd expect by knocking out that chunk. But then when you learn that there's loads of planets, you just knock out that chunk there, and this chunk there and this chunk there. And at that point, if you do the calculation, I'll leave it as an exercise, it will be that the relative strength of supernaturalism over naturalism is decreased, having noticed that there are loads of planets. This is a very simplified model, but if you calculate it through, the discovery of life will provide a boost for supernaturalism. The discovery that there are loads of planets will then provide some of a compensating boost to naturalism. That's how it's going to work. Of course, how the numbers play out will depend a lot on these proportions and all sorts of other things. But if you understand what I'm saying, you'll see structurally, just because of the fact that there are larger chunks of no life in the few planet slivers with naturalism than chunks of no life in the loads of planets slivers of naturalism. The result is that when you look out into the world and you see loads of planets, you should have a mild sinking feeling about theism, at least if this is your evidential situation. I mean, how sinking and what your output credence is going to be will depend on all sorts of details about the priors. But this toy model convinces me that at least for a lot of natural ways of doing the priors, looking out into the world and seeing loads of planets is going to be a boost to naturalism. And I think I'm not being very tendentious. I think this should convince you that it's not so hard to imagine epistemic situations where someone's got no clue about whether there are lots of planets, whether there's lots of planets or a few planets, and looks out into the world, discovers that there's a lot, and then the credence for supernaturalism goes down. It's very natural to think that that's how things work. What I'm going to do in part 2 is I'm going to move to the fine-tuning hypothesis and express some reservations about how those discussions normally go. I'm going to give you a certain way of looking at the fine-tuning hypothesis, which, at least when you look at it my way, you should start to feel a bit of puzzlement as to how it's supposed to work. Again, I'm going to be using very simple models, and you have to get a feel for for these models. But yeah, I mean, I've told you all you need to know to start to get a feel. So task one is to look at fine-tuning and get into my frame of mind where it looks kind of odd how the discussions are going. And then secondly, I'd like to say a little bit about non-empirical evidence and how that starts to look from a Bayesian perspective and how that interacts with the scientific worldview. Okay, I'm going to call it good there. Thanks.